Morning, everyone. I think you're going to find we're pretty passionate about what we're going to talk about for the next 90 minutes, so we're all very glad to see you here. Our game plan for this session is I'm going to talk just a little bit about the business problem that we're trying to solve and some things that are going on. Can you hear now? Okay. And then Erwin's going to talk about the bigger picture with remote interpretation and video remote interpretation. And then Matt and Marcus are going to talk about both local and statewide pilots that they're doing. So that's real rubber meets the road kind of stuff. I think you'll find very interesting. So let me just talk just briefly about the business problem. As we all know, we've had requirements to do interpretation for criminal cases for a long time. And even with criminal cases, it's been a business problem for many of us. Both the costs and the delay of getting qualified interpreters for cases is an issue, particularly in more remote or rural courts, but often for all of us for the less popular or frequent languages. So it's been a long-standing business problem even from that point of view, but then a few years ago when the Federal Department of Justice Civil Rights Division started telling courts that they had to do this for civil cases as well, this then became a really serious business problem for many of us. From a cost point of view, just when the Great Recession was going on and we had less money to do things with to begin with. So that started people thinking about maybe it might be more acceptable to do remote forms of interpretation than it had been in the past. Even though we all just listened to David Pogue talk about how fast the technology is moving in the world, what we all know, you and I, is that the courts are a very conservative industry, and even doing something like this, which is technically not that path-breaking, is still a big deal for the courts. So we know also that from a national or semi-national point of view, audio and remote interpretation has been done, and many have used it for some years now. But we're concentrating in this session on video remote interpretation for a couple of reasons. One of which is it's used for other things besides interpretation, and also for some of the advantages it has in regard to things like due process. So we think that the value add that's going to come from doing remote video interpretation is going to be really important to the courts over the next few years. Now, one thing that I want to just mention before I turn it over to Erwin that we're working on at the national level, and this is really a partnership between the National Center for State Courts and the 50 state court systems as represented by their state court administrators, is a project to try and provide to you all at some point in the next year or so an ability to get interpreters from anywhere in the United States through the internet. So this would be an on-demand national capability. It's sometimes called the cloud when you go to the internet and you don't care where it is in the world and you get a service. So the idea here is that you could be in a court anywhere and contact the website and get the interpreter for the language you need from the cloud on a national basis. It's a really interesting project. It hasn't happened yet. We're hoping maybe in the next year or so, as I said, that something like that can be piloted. So stay tuned for information on that as we move ahead. There'll probably be more about that this summer, later. So with no further ado, I think I'm going to turn it over to Erwin, who's going to talk about some of the big picture aspects of remote interpretation, and then we'll see how it works in real life.
Thank you, Tom. Just a note about our timing. We got an email from Tom. Let's see how this is working. Allocating our time, 15-20 minutes. And yesterday, a couple of days ago, we got an email from him that said, Erwin, if you save a little time that we met, and the other colleague will have more time. So I'm very cognizant about that limitation. I will use my iPhone as a real-time stopwatch here, make sure that I do not go over the time. I've been in this position with the, can you hear me well? Or better this way, without the, no. My first couple of weeks on the job, I had a request from a rural county for an interpreter, a rare interpreter. They sort of call it a canton interpreter. That's all they could say. So I asked the clerk, court administrator, to send me an email. So I have a record of the request, and I can reply appropriately. And then she politely told me, that's a really great idea, because I hear you kind of speak foreign too. I want to make sure you understand what I need. And I did get an email. By the way, they do not have Hungarian translation yet. So if you need a translation, sorry, you have to wait a little bit more. I thought, considering the time, we only have really just time to highlight some of the considerations related to language access and the video remote interpreting project. To start with, I'd like to sort of invite you to think about language access in the context of cultural and linguistic competency as it relates to the court's personal jurisdiction. If we are here in the state, in Texas, and if we violate, let's say, any kind of policy or rule, the Texas courts have jurisdiction over us. And that's true around the country. So if we consider language access as part of the broader court's personal jurisdiction, I think it's going to be much easier to find solutions and not only look at language access from a perspective of perhaps advocacy. So as we think about the language access, think about the scope that the courts have to deal with. We are obligated to provide linguistic access to all courts' programs and services. And oftentimes we really don't think about the boundaries, obligations that the courts have to consider, especially with regard to our legal obligation. The courts historically have been very proactive in training interpreters since the early 90s, mid-90s, when the consortium started to develop testing procedures and training procedures. But what we find ourselves often faced with is we are expected to assume the legal obligation of other players in the judicial process, advocates, attorneys, and so forth, in fulfilling the obligation of providing language access. And I just want to present this to you as a question. Can we, as a court system, or should we, allow others who play an important role in the judicial process to delegate that legal obligation to us? And what does that do to our processes, not only financially, but also ethically and legally? And if you consider, as Tom mentioned, the high demand for interpreters that we face on a daily basis, and the lack of interpreters and trainings, the lack of national certification standards and training standards, we find ourselves really at a difficult road. How do we fulfill our own obligation, and what happens with the other obligations that we oftentimes assume from various players in this process? So the necessity, considering the demographic changes in our societies, are the need to communicate with the limited English proficient, with the deaf and hard of hearing individuals, does face a challenge, and I think the virtual video remote interpreting will provide a realistic opportunity to meet these challenges, both legal and practical challenges, in a very good way. Another consideration I'd like to invite you to think about as administrators in running your court systems, think about the role of a court-provided interpreter. Every state has various approaches and rules related to the roles of an interpreter. The language access issue, as it became more evident in the 90s, early 90s, resulted in a model code being drafted by the consortium, the National Center of State Courts, and it was widely adopted by many state courts. The question is how many state courts really took the time to synchronize these model codes, model language, with local laws, rules of evidence, civil procedures, criminal procedures, and so forth. We find ourselves oftentimes, on a daily basis, with the reality where an interpreter is involved in a court proceeding. As a court interpreter, we sort of expect and oftentimes obligate interpreters to crisscross the roles that they should follow, these obligations, and that oftentimes results in confidentiality clauses being waived, ethical standards being violated, and so forth. Again, think about this in the perspective of a virtual reality, virtual interpreters being available on demand to more players in a judicial process than just one interpreter being there in person. And we'll have, I think, some time to discuss this as we cover some of the other topics. If we think about the daily demands on providing interpreters in 40, 50, 60 languages, depending on your state's demographics, our current reality with the consortium, we have probably, Tina, about 17 languages that we provide testing. 19 now. So we have, and even these tests, these certification tests range. We have full tests and partial tests. So but what happens to the rest of the 80, 70, 80, 90 languages that we have to provide interpreting for on a daily basis in our court system? What happens today, we take what we have. Either somebody else decides what's acceptable and drafts rules for us, or we come to the table and we become part of this discussion. So I would like to encourage all of you to really think about this as a call for action in deciding what is the best interest of your courts as we move forward. Sooner or later, remote interpreting, video remote interpreting will be there for everyone. The technology is already there. So we will either face a decision a few years down the road to take what's out there and have to amend our court processes to the available resources and technology, or become part of the solution at this point and draft and communicate our specific needs up front. The benefits of a well-developed remote interpreting program, virtual program on a national level will obviously result in much better quality. How many of you ever heard of Language Line or some other type of telephonic interpreting services? Excellent. Do you know or have any idea who is on the other line? You have absolutely no idea most of the time. Okay? One of the main reasons our judges in Kentucky are reluctant in using Language Line is because they never know about the certification and the experience of the interpreter on the other line, not to mention Kentucky-specific knowledge and so forth. If we could agree on a national standard with regard to training, certification, reciprocity, a lot of these questions will be answered. If I can tell my judge that it does not matter if the person on the telephone or on the video screen is not in Kentucky, but I can guarantee you that the person has the same training, the same certification and credentials as an interpreter here in Kentucky, it will be a lot more widely accepted in our court proceedings. So quality is number one. Obviously, it will help us with our compliance, obviously, with federal and state laws. We have to provide language access. So I would like to invite you to continue a discussion and thinking, and I would love to hear suggestions from you about what you would consider a necessary part and component of a national standard for interpreter training, interpreter certification, credentialing interpreters, and certifying interpreters in your state. We would love to have these input from you. I'm sort of thinking about the interpreter profession as a parallel to the legal profession. We go to law school. Those of you who went to law school, we pass a bar exam, and then you get certified in your state. If we want the interpreting profession to be closely aligned with the judicial process, we have to agree to a national certification standard, to a national training standard, administered obviously by institutions that comply with these standards. And then we can set expectations to the profession instead of manipulating and amending our own court rules to make it work with whatever the demand are, whatever the services are available. So again, I invite you to please let us know what you think in your state the needs are, and some of the necessary component, as you understand from your perspective, should include with regard to national standard on training and certification. It would be obviously more efficient if you have rural counties. Oftentimes we have to send interpreters for 15 or 20-minute hearing to a rural county, and the cost ranges from several hundred to a couple $1,000s. How much more efficient would that be to deliver it via telephone or video platform? I think an important aspect of a national video remote interpreting service project that's available to state courts will improve accountability. We would have much more accountability with regard to the service provider. We should be part of the contract expressing our needs, our expectations to the service provider, instead of just accepting whatever the service, whatever services are available. There would be much more accountability with regard to the interpreter that we use. The public, for instance, would also benefit, and then we could also set certain expectations to the public. Oftentimes this demand for language access seems to be a one-way street, but we don't talk much about what kind of expectations we can set to the public. Think about the pro se issue. How do you manage the pro se issue? And how could you or your court system incorporate a video platform in managing pro se related topics? Potential benefits with regard to state courts would also include not only hearings involving interpreters, but hearings and interactions not involving interpreters. Juvenile court, for instance, drug court, pretrial services, etc. In Kentucky, we've been experimenting with our pretrial department in 6 regions of the state, and it's been very successful. And actually, we are now looking into updating our state network, significant investment in creating a stable network that will support a video platform. We're at a stage, I was mentioning to Tom earlier, that our hardware is being outdated, so we have to look at new hardware, and so at the same time the need for a platform that sustains a high quality video interpreting is very important. HR functions, and you can put the list, include anything you want on this list. Remote training and continuing education. We started to use this for interpreters and judges and so forth. Several of our judges, rural judges, would love to have a video platform for various hearings that would save the courts tremendous amount of money by not having to transport inmates from one jurisdiction to another. Think about advocates, defense counsels. If they could have access to a video platform and interview a client in jail, okay, they wouldn't have to go and travel. Visitations, and you just name it. So really, what we would love to ask court administrators for some input on how can we develop a virtual reality platform for your courts that benefits you. A lot of our processes and practices have been developed and drafted back when judges commuted from one county to another on horsebacks. Okay, it's time to rethink some of our court processes, procedures, and incorporate technology that benefits the courts. A couple of other benefits I just wanted to mention here. They refer to includes attorneys, advocates. We had several interesting requests for mediation, ADR, where we had a deaf party who lost his hearing as an adult and could not sign. So we had to integrate card service provider remotely, and also an attorney who is a mediator who could not be there in person but had experience. So we had to integrate several parties on one platform. Every state has the, various needs and different needs, but I think the potential of a stable video platform in your court system could revolutionize the way you run court, the way you offer services to the public. And also, to me, this is very important. I represent the courts. I'm not an advocate for the public. I represent the interest of the courts. My interpreters are there for the benefit of the court. We have a legal obligation in providing access to our courts, access to justice. And I'm very reluctant providing that service, sharing that service with other stakeholders, with attorneys and other justice partners who themselves have a legal obligation in providing linguistic access. How many of you have encountered a case where an attorney walks into court with an LEP client or a deaf client and they have never talked to the client, never communicated with the client? It happens on a daily basis. So I think video access to interpreters, on-demand access to interpreters would allow all participants in the judicial process to have on-demand access to attorney-client confidential communication without violating legal boundaries and ethical boundaries, and doing so very efficiently. Another interesting topic, an area that would benefit from a video platform, as I mentioned, would be the pro se litigants. I envision in our courts in Kentucky an access booth in a public area where pro se litigants would not only have access to an interpreter through a interactive web server, a web service portal, but potentially also to advocates. You know, if the state, the state bar associations, ABA, for instance, would embrace, and various other partners, services delivered to states via a web portal, video remote interpreting sort of a video platform. I think our pro se, managing our pro se cases would be much easier. I was really surprised when I saw the percentage of pro se cases in various states. Our pro se cases, especially in family court, is upwards to 60 or 70%. And so we are really facing a tremendous dilemma in offering services without becoming part of the case, without becoming advocates for a party. And so, again, I would invite you to consider this technology. We would love to hear from you with your needs, your input, and also some ideas as far as how you in your states could incorporate a technology like this to deliver interpreting services and potentially also benefit other departments of your courts. Thank you.
Well, good morning, everyone. It's just great to see everybody. Can I start with a personal confession? I mentioned to my son, who's an MIS major at the University of Arizona, that I would be talking to you about technology this morning, and he just started laughing. And he says, what could you possibly share with that group, Dad? I mean, every time he comes home, we're asking, can you help set up our telephones and computers and whatnot? And maybe that's telling, because really I want to talk to you more about the project and project management and some of the management issues. I'll start with just two quick acknowledgments if I can. First, I want to thank Tom and the National Center. They've provided a lot of leadership here, and I think you'll be hearing a lot more about the project. Tom's also written a wonderful paper for COSCA, the Conference of State Court Administrators, so I think will kind of help move this project forward. And then secondly, Matt. This guy presented back at COSCA years ago in Santa Barbara, and I sat there and I was just transfixed. And I brought that project back and I said, Judge, my presiding judge, this is something we have to do, and we need to do it now. And we need to do it off budget cycle. And she kind of looked at me, really, you're really kind of revved up. But it was so dramatic. And then I had the chance to visit your court, Matt, and just was really inspired. I've had the opportunity to work in two different environments. One at the Metropolitan Court there in Phoenix, in Maricopa County. And so I'll share that project real quickly. And now I'm trying to use some of that same background, some of that information on a statewide project. So it's kind of funny how these things sort of converge. The challenge, and I know you all have your challenges, and I think Erwin did a really good job kind of painting a picture of that, but for us it's mainly geography. Just an enormous state with a lot of national parks, kind of the national barriers. I was just hiking up at the North Rim, and there was a sign 143 miles to the South Rim, okay? And you could look across the canyon, but the Colorado River and whatnot, and Maricopa County, just to give you a sense, is 9,800 square miles. So just huge. You can sit in the car all day driving across that county. Remote court locations as well. The other concern, really two urban areas, Tucson and Phoenix, and Phoenix alone would have about 63% of the qualified interpreters. We just can't find a lot of those services in a lot of the other counties. A growing minority population, I think that's probably true in a lot of your courts as well. And then just all that downtime when we do send the contractors out, just a crazy amount of wheel time for folks going across the county or the state. This I thought was interesting, the demographics. I won't read this to you, but Phoenix now has become a predominantly minority city. So you can just see these changes, and it's not just for interpreter services. I start to think about the website and all the court forms we provide, and the IVR systems and so on. So just, I think, a big challenge there. The hope, I think, and I think it's probably universal, is to provide access to the court proceedings. Our plan, I know the LE plan would also talk about court forms and court services, a lot of what happens at the counter, and I wish we had more time today. I'd love to delve into that longer. Providing interpreters for these short cause matters, and I might even challenge that. I'm seeing them used even in some longer hearings now. I think the technology is that good. Trying to help cut back that travel time and the cost with travel. There's even a risk in travel if you think about it, and so we're trying to really contain that. And even for the interpreters that stay back at the office, maybe giving them time to do more transcript work and other kinds of administrative functions that would otherwise be kind of what you say windshield time. I'm going to start with this Maricopa County project if I can, and walk you through this real quickly. Now that's a county that would serve about 4 million people. I mentioned to you that big landmass, and they probably have a staff of about 30, 35 interpreters, mostly Spanish, but also some sign language interpreters. And then they use many, many contractors. Huge cost center, as you can imagine, the contract costs, especially for those lesser used languages. Their project was based really on the work that Matt had done, and you'll see, I'm not going to read these to you, but you'll see that they have some central interpreter rooms downtown, and 4 of those, and I'll show you those in just a moment. And then they've tried to equip several kind of strategically placed courts with that system that would be used in the courtrooms, the remote video. And some of those you'll see, like Gila Bend and Buckeye, those are a long drive, probably 60 to 70 miles to get out to some of those courts. Those would be traffic courts, justice courts, and so on. And that's where I think we found great utility. But at the same time, there's a commitment now that any new buildings, any new regional courts, any new courtroom now would be equipped with this technology, even if it's in the downtown core. And so the new criminal tower has 22 courtrooms all set with the video that you might say, gosh, why? Well, it is so efficient for those kind of short matters. Here's a listing of those, and what doesn't show here would be that criminal tower project. So probably all total now, about 35 courtrooms in Maricopa County with this technology. Here are those downtown sort of central locations where the interpreter could go into that small office and then actually dial into the courtroom. And I think I'll just take you right in there to kind of let you see the courtroom. Tom's paper talked a lot about integration of systems, and I think this is important. A lot of you have a big investment. Maybe a show of hands. How many of you folks have some sort of video recording or PA systems in your courtrooms? Yeah, most everybody, I imagine. So I thought Maricopa did a great job with the integration here, saying, gosh, we could leverage that. We could use all those kind of expensive microphones, and we could use a lot of that technology. We can also make sure that this is all integrated with the recording system, so we have a complete digital record. And so I won't walk you through the technology, but I think they did a great job. They used the county's wide area network, and that's, of course, is entirely secure, sort of an IP-based technology. So that was their approach there. Here then you see an interpreter at the workstation, and essentially can dial right into the courtroom, pick any one of the courtrooms of those 35 courtrooms, and then come in as needed into that courtroom and start proceedings. Key to it is, I think there's this one camera we needed to add to every courtroom, and it's a tilt-pan camera, and it's kind of amazing. I call it Cyclops, okay? But this camera can zoom in, and you'll see they can have different views of the podium, the judge's bench, everything, I think, but the jury box, okay? And that allows them to really kind of follow the proceedings, have really a good context of what's going on there. Here are a couple more views there. They are also controlling a switch box, okay, which will decide what stuff needs to be, what proceedings need to be public, that would be heard by the whole courtroom, and what would be maybe more private sidebars with the defendant and attorneys as well. Equipment is pretty basic. One would be these wireless microphones that we all use for these kind of presentations. I always see the church pastor with these microphones. But the headset is interesting. If you look at it, it's 2 channels, okay? So one would allow the transmission of the proceedings in the court, open court, if you will. The other would be that closed communication of the translation, the interpreter. And the defendant or the litigant would be vice versa, would actually hear the interpreter speaking then in that second language. So that's how that works, and it's wireless, and it's really, I think, served them very, very well. It's just pretty seamless. And I know I'm talking fast, but I want to try to make the best use of our time. So we learned a lot from that project, and when I moved to the state office, they said, is that something we could do then for some of the courts across the state? And we talked about it and did a little bit of survey work, and we found the very same kind of needs, I would say almost on steroids. Some of those counties, like I mentioned, the Grand Canyon, even tougher kind of demands. Some of those drive times can be 4.5 hours, and so it made sense to us to kind of explore that. So here then you see the administrative office located in Phoenix, is sort of headquarters, if you will, with just one of those kind of offices I showed you for interpreters, and then our 3 pilot projects there, Mojave County, Yuma County, and Cochise, which is really almost on the border of Mexico. So you can imagine some of their interpreter needs. What we've then tried to do is set up the communications, and it is bidirectional to that central office and the administrative office. But this is sort of a new twist that I thought was pretty intriguing. It's not been used, but it is set up now, and technically these courts could actually assist each other. And you start to think about this, you have a lot of downtime for interpreters, or maybe a case where there's I kind of think of resource leveling, and one court might help another. Not sure how they would handle the payment for this or the contracts, but my sense is we could work through that. And we have 15 counties, and so I can imagine a day where there could be some sort of an online calendar system, and Matt may even talk about that a little bit, that would allow for coordination of those services. So I think very promising, although that was not maybe in our initial thinking. Now, Yuma County is on the Arizona-California border, and it started very small. We thought we might help a couple justice courts, but just look at this, folks. This thing has sort of exploded now, where they've actually included the probation department, the jail, and some of the other offices, and they're actually asking for a little bit of additional equipment for some new sites now as well. And so this is sort of, I would say, a small to mid-sized court system, but you can just sort of see the power of this when you start to kind of think out of the box, and I think we see real payback. I was there visiting, maybe about 6 weeks ago, and talked to the administrator. She shared with me that one of the interpreters had used this for about a 12-minute hearing. Okay, it was, I think, a small claims case. And she said in the past that would have been about 4.5 hours in the car driving. So you can just imagine. And so we asked him to keep some statistics, and I'm not ready to do the cost-benefit analysis. Sorry, Tom. Tom's our economist. But the sheets I showed, I just said sort of kind of the back of the envelope. It looked to me like about $14,000 in savings already since March of this year for that kind of drive time, if you kind of make certain assumptions. And I didn't put in any of the gas cost or utility, but just the average interpreter cost for that kind of a project. Their setup is similar to Maricopa County, different equipment set, and I think on some of this they were starting from scratch, and it may in some ways be a little bit easier. So everything has high level of integration with this interpreter phone system, and then the kind of the high quality video you see there as well. Here's a closer look at that, and we can talk more about this, but I think a lot of this is sort of commodity. The key is to have tight integration and really be pretty thoughtful. How does that fit into the local court environment? One of the courts I showed you, Mojave, had a huge investment in another vendor, so that tended to be more expensive, but you can still do that with just time and money, I guess, and so we were able to use some of that equipment as well. I mentioned to you the other departments. The other thing to note, where it's not simultaneous translation, so like probation officers and whatnot, a lot of those installations can be at a much lower cost. They don't have to have that two-band kind of a setup I mentioned, and there may be a third to a fifth of the cost. And so when I think of that, I thought that was a really nice kind of a way to leverage that technology, but without a large investment. The statewide project, I think, does, I don't know, it's economies of scale that you maybe, it's almost hard to extrapolate where this may lead, but most of the time, I think a lot of these counties can't even find an interpreter in those lesser languages, and they would pay for a whole day of contracting, and they would come from Phoenix or sometimes California to help out. And my sense is that now they could have those interpreters come to that Phoenix office, to the AOC, and they might have a very short hearing, and we would pay for just those hours used for the contractor, and a lot of those contracts have sort of minimum use there. The interpreters locally then can stay at that downtown courthouse, generally the Superior Court, but then help their city courts and justice courts. That's what we see in Yuma County at this point. I made this note about translation of documents. How many of you folks have a lot of work in that area? Yeah, I see a few heads nodding. We cannot hardly keep up with those needs under Title VI, and so my sense is those staff interpreters can help with that, and they are doing that right now in Maricopa County during some of that downtime. It just makes it a lot easier to manage those kind of resources. Operational efficiencies, and we'll always, it's funny, we always think about the interpreters and the cost center, but really the most expensive thing, if you think about it, the judge's time and the judge's staff. And so that's where I would start with maybe the efficiencies. And I have heard of a lot of downtime where they'll actually go into recess and or maybe set the cause in the afternoon. Can you imagine that inconvenience? And so most of that, I think, goes away with this sort of a model. Better coverage, ad hoc requests, and they do come up, I know, can be handled as needed there. Travel time, the reduced contractor cost. I know in Maricopa County they were just trying to contain those contractor costs, which really had really budget busters, if you will, over the last few years. And then the idea of translation of documents. The funding model that we used was sort of a matching sort of approach. So we came up with some state grant money to help these courts with their initial pilot projects. And it was roughly 50%, it would sort of depend. And then we asked them to kind of work with their local boards of supervisors for that local match. And the benefit of that was, I thought so interesting, to go to some of Erwin's comments, I think it really increased the sensitivity. There was really, I think the county board, the county managers, they're pretty thoughtful, and they started to really think, gosh, what about all these Title VI requirements and what's really necessary here? So all three of those boards unanimously approved these projects, the funding. It's actually a fourth one that's in the works now. And so I think that's good, how would you say, good leadership. It's good public policy that's kind of being formed through this budget process. The other note, too, when you do branch out to probation and juvenile courts, I don't know, it just seems like they're flush with extra money that maybe you would not have in court administration. So our adult probation services said, gosh, we can pay for those jail cameras. We can go ahead and pay for those remote probation departments. And I don't know if that would be true in your court. In Arizona, that's actually under the judicial branch. But kind of nice to leverage all that funding. And I have a sense we're going to go back to that well many, many times and probably finish out any probation components without ever touching kind of our traditional state grants. Cost benefit, like I say, I'm not prepared to share numbers. I know Maricopa had done a lot of that work with the budget office when they went from their sort of 5-court pilot to the expansion. But first and foremost, what you're really doing is providing the services that are actually a matter of law, okay? And I think that's the most important thing. And I think they're quality kind of services, too. It's not this sort of ad hoc, how we kind of slop through that, maybe using staff reporters and whatnot. The savings I mentioned, I made a mention about just travel. I think there's a lot of travel. We've had accidents out in the field with probation officers and others, and you imagine the cost of it. You're trying to contain that risk for the staff and for the vehicles and equipment as well. And then I think if we really do move to this statewide approach, my sense is we really will be able to actually contain those costs by sharing. And I could even see some calendar coordination where you try to handle those high volume calendars, just sort of stagger some of those matters and then share maybe the court reporter, the court interpreters that we have on staff. I think with that, I'll just mention, I think this is my final slide, but I just wanted to mention there's a human factor in all this. And it gets kind of lost, I think, with all the equipment and the money and all that kind of stuff. But one of the lead public defenders in Maricopa County has a hearing impairment, okay, and has always worked very effectively even with that impairment. But he was, you can imagine, kind of skeptical about all this. And there was a concern, maybe this might not even be something that could be used in felony matters in Superior Court. It's okay for small claims and traffic. And it was so interesting to me. He came into one of these courtrooms in the very initial pilot in the basement of the Central Court building and spent about a half an hour out there. And he actually told the administrator, this is actually better than the real thing. This is better than live, okay? And I was just stunned. And so I made an appointment, actually went to visit. I said, are you sure about this? Because I'd like to share that with folks and whatnot. I said, that's really, he goes, no, this technology is so advanced. And this is the same group, I think, had been concerned about digital recording of records in the earlier days and whatnot. And but I share that because I think the technology really has evolved, okay? But you need to, and I think you touched on this, you really do need to have the stakeholders involved. You need to make sure you have that buy-in, because I think if it weren't for that, I don't know if I'd be able to make such a strong business case today. We probably would be more in these limited jurisdiction courts. So that's background. And with that, I think we're going to hear from the Florida courts here. And I think you won't believe the work that Matt has done in this area. So.
Well, thank you. I'm going to give you about a 20-minute quick visual tour of what we're doing in the Ninth Circuit. And our system developed purely out of desperation. And from administrative side, it was just, we didn't have enough money, we didn't have enough resources to provide a due process service. For some quick background, the state of Florida, Orange County, and Osceola County make up the Ninth Circuit. And that gives us a population of almost 1.4 million. With 76 judicial officers and an additional 250 to 500,000 daily tourists added to our population. The coverage includes the Orange County Courthouse, the Osceola County Courthouse, Juvenile Justice Center, 3 courthouses, 3 branch courthouses, and 3 courtrooms in the jail. So our interpreters are responsible for covering 7 court facilities, 67 courtrooms over 2,200 square miles. And numbers are a little dated, but this is the numbers for the last presentation I pulled out. This gives you an idea of the number of interpretation events that our interpreters have to cover. And you look at like Haitian Creole, well, that's only 4.1%. Well, that's 4 events daily that we have to cover. Sign language, that's 1.4 sign language events that we have to arrange and we have to cover. It comes out to 91 hearings per day that require a court interpreter. And that comes out to 11 hearings per interpreter. If we send one of our interpreters to one of those branch courthouses, we lose that interpreter for an entire day for a 10-minute hearing. So that starts piling up to 18, 19, 20 hearings for the other interpreters. To give you the scope of the staff we have to cover those 22,000 events, we have 1 managing court interpreter who is an acting court interpreter, 8 Spanish interpreters. We have a contractual budget to supplement the other languages and Spanish. And since 2004, we've had salary restrictions, hiring freezes that have resulted in actual employment of 6.2 full-time interpreters to cover those 22,000. So this is what we were facing. The challenges, we had to provide quality, certified interpreter services for over 22,000 court hearings per year with 8 staff interpreters, a hiring freeze, declining contractual service budget, increased demand for services. It's probably a situation that most of us are in. And on top of that, we had to cover 67 courtrooms and 7 court facilities spread out among 2 counties. We're a little short on time, so I won't give you any background on how we got here, but this is our current solution, and that's virtual remote interpreting. And that's to provide on-demand, simultaneous interpreter services to multiple court facilities located throughout the Ninth Circuit from any interpreter workstation. So that means an interpreter, instead of hopping on the busy I-4 corridor and getting to a branch courthouse, can actually hop around between courthouses from a single location. Our experience in the Ninth, we went live in October 2007 using analog telephone lines, but doing bidirectional simultaneous interpreting over those analog telephone lines. Our initial installation was designed and maintained by the Ninth Circuit, utilized existing digital court reporting infrastructure. So we were already doing remote court reporting, so we hopped on that infrastructure, and it was funded from our existing budget. We did not ask for any additional dollars for this. We set up 5 remote workstations, which has since expanded, and our current coverage includes initial appearances, arraignments, VOPs, dependency and delinquency hearings and trials, and traffic and misdemeanor cases. Of those 22,000 events, 19,000 or so were covered, can be covered remotely. Our current solution is a 2-way video conference system integrated into the court audio system. What's key about this, I think, is the challenges for those that want to do remote interpreting is you have to control the audio in that remote site. The video is not as challenging. It's controlling the audio that's the challenge. The pros of this system, excellent audio and video. It's digital quality over the network. It's stable. It includes two-way. Our initial design was only one way. The interpreter could see the courtroom. We found out that it was very beneficial for the parties in the courtroom to see the interpreter. Integrated into the existing digital court reporting infrastructure. It works with mixer control software, which is very simple for the interpreter to control. And it works concurrently with the telephone interface system, which was our first attempt at this, and I'll show you why that's important in a minute. Potential video conference expansion. Every single courtroom this goes into, now we have an advanced IP-based video conferencing system. Includes sign language services. Cons, currently it's mixer dependent, so if you're not using Biyant mixers, you're out of luck. And it's not scalable outside of our circuit. And I'll show you where we're going from this that will solve those problems. This will give you an idea what the interpreter sees at their workstation. You got the courtroom up. They can hop any courtroom that we have that's remote in our circuit, and they can actually switch the audio simply by mouse from going from private to defendant to courtroom, and then they can disconnect. And that gives you, that's a picture of one of our interpreters. This is actually her computer workstation. So we've actually, those are her computer speakers. That's her second monitor. When she's not on, she has two monitors. So we leveraged all that to kind of make it more of an elegant or simple solution because they're cramped in space. And this pad here is a touch pad. She can hop around, not only to anywhere on our network. We use that for just video conferencing. If it's a personal video conference, but she can hop around to any courtroom in our circuit. So from here, she can go out to Osceola County. She can go over to Juvenile Justice Center. She can go to the jail. When that traditionally would have taken 3 interpreters an entire day. She can do it from her desktop. And this is just a demo real quick so you can actually see it in action.
Juan Manuel Gonzalez Santos.
Now, Popka, this courthouse is about 20 miles away.
Una acusación de un delito penal de haber manejado con una licencia.
See your control
vencida
software
por
up there
más
so
de
she can
6
control
meses.
a mixer that's located
Esta es la
20 miles
tercera
away in the
vez
courtroom.
que a usted le imponen esta acusación.
Civil, anytime it's alleged that someone was exceeding the speed limit by 30 miles per hour or more, they are required to come to court. So that is why you are here today, sir. What I would like to find out, sir, is whether or not you wish to have a full hearing.
This is the key to
on this matter,
simultaneous,
sir, or if
which
you
is
wish
a
to
standard
solve
at our
this
circuit.
matter today.
Resolve the case today.
All right, sir, then how do you plead to the charge of driving 75 miles an hour in a 45-mile-an-hour zone?
I have 3 options, correct?
Guilty, no guilty, and
Not guilty.
Guilty, not guilty?
Not guilty, guilty, no contest.
yes.
No contest. Entiende usted bien que al asentar esa declaración de no me opongo, yo lo voy a adjudicar culpable de este delito. A usted se le va a imponer $200 de multa y $360 de cosas judiciales. ¿Entiende? Yes. Usted tiene también 2 otras infracciones.
It kind of gives you an idea real quick just so you can see visually what we do. But from that workstation, when she's done there, she can hop right back on and she's over in a courtroom on the other side of the circuit. We also use this for remote sign language interpreter services. We contract with a vendor. It's an IP-based video conferencing service. We pay by the minute, and we match our resources with our demand. So we have on-demand scheduling for this. It's portable. We can roll it into a courtroom, multiple languages. It matches resources with demand. 50% of our sign language, before we went to the system, 50% of our events were never actually heard. So we were paying for an interpreter that we never needed. So now it's 50%, so there's a cost avoidance factor there. Charges are applied per minute. There's no 2-hour minimum for a 10-minute hearing. Our contractual expenditure is substantially lower, and this gives you a picture. And this is a magistrate hearing here, and this is a same system used for sign language, and obviously they don't have to control the mixer for this. So actually, it's a little simpler to set up for this. Now we also do very remote interpreting, and this is where our interpreters can cover on the weekend. But we've since learned now we have the technology. We can have people tie in really from anywhere in the country with the following requirements. They need a laptop, headset and a microphone, internet connection, web camera, Cisco Jabber video client, which is free, and a cell phone. Now, my guess, this is not a large investment. And that means you can literally sit there in your home and you can provide simultaneous interpretation and you can control the audio in that courtroom. And that's the key, with a touch-tone phone. And we've also, this is a picture providing with a laptop. And this is actually, we just found out we could do this. This is a 7-inch mini iPad. You see the cell phone there, and why that's important is because our initial installation, we used analog telephone lines, so all our mixers have a telephone interface card at about $150 a pop, which means we can dial in. We don't have to use the audio of the telephone line, but we can use the telephone line to control the mixer. So by hitting the number 7 and 8, he can actually toggle the audio in the courtroom from a private to public conversation. So that equipment there is probably outside the cell phone cost, is probably you're looking about $350 worth of equipment that they can do that from anywhere in the country. The results, obviously we provide a qualified certified interpreter to more litigants over a much broader geographical area, reduces the need for contract interpreters, reduces travel for staff interpreters. It's also the most cost-effective use of staff and contractors. We have a Russian interpreter. We have 2 vents in Orange and Osceola County. We put the contract interpreter on the system, and they provide it. So we're using 1 contract interpreter instead of 2. In 2011, 2012, we actually reduced our contractual budget by $114,000, and that's actually a real number. Operational efficiencies, obviously we can cover more hearings, reduces court wait times for interpreters. A judge gets an interpreter when a judge needs an interpreter. Resource match, demand, cost avoidance. What's next? And this is probably the most exciting thing where we're going with this. We have worked, and it's one shout out for Cisco, so that we've worked and partnered with Cisco in developing a scalable solution, which is mixer agnostic, which means you can get into any courtroom, not dependent upon the type of hardware they have for their audio. The pros, it includes 2-way audio, very similar. It's now using the IP phone system that you saw Marcus's court was using for audio. It's a contact center call manager that can connect thousands of venues, ad hoc on-demand scheduling, and I'm going to show you why that's so important. Obviously, video conferencing, it's scalable to multiple circuits. We can hop outside our circuit now. The cons, it is beta technology. It's an untested business plan as far as pooling interpreters. What's happened so far in the state of Florida, the 7th and 9th Circuit engaged in a pilot project where we actually set that technology up, and we successfully, as a proof of concept, we were able to cover the 7th Circuit, they were able to cover the 9th Circuit. And what was interesting, we found out that it was connected through county networks, internet, with no quality of service. So probably could not have a worse arrangement technically than this. We never had a failure, and the quality was always excellent. Where it actually, you're guaranteed a certain amount of bandwidth so you get the audio and video. So basically it was a crapshoot every time we connected, because there was no dedicated pipe for that service, yet we never had an issue. The second phase of the pilot project now that we're working through is the 7th, the 9th, the 15th, and a designated rural circuit. And that is planned, and hopefully will be rolled out very soon, that we can actually test the pooling model. And that's 5 participating counties. We'll test the pool of interpreters, on-demand scheduling, on the state network. And just recently, the Office of State Courts Administrator submitted a request for information document for a possible statewide solution. I want to demonstrate just real quick some of the advantages of on-demand scheduling. Courts are inherently dysfunctional in how they schedule. We have open-ended events. We don't know if they're 5 minutes or 15 minutes. Try scheduling an interpreter for that. Okay, I got a Russian interpreter. You're going to serve at 1:30 for 15 minutes. The hearing goes 1:45. that interpreter, for all practical purposes, is done for the day if they're on a schedule at that point. The advantages of on-demand scheduling is you have on-demand services. There are no cancellations. It works within our scheduling challenges. Courts do not have to wait for an interpreter. Resources equal demand. Interpreter can cover many venues and multiple locations from a single workstation. It's limited to languages provided by the pool, but you can actually connect a third-party service to it. So this can be solved also if you use a third-party service. We currently use a third-party service for sign language. And obviously we'd need some kind of management reports to determine current and future resource allocation, because a lot of people, they look at this, what happens if the court dials up and there's no interpreter? Well, what happens now? They wait, okay? Your wait time will be much, much less and much less frequent. Just visually, if there's a judge in Marion County, in Circuit 5, needs an interpreter, this is the tablet that's residing on the bench or with the clerk. We have pooled interpreters in the 1st, the 2nd, the 3rd, the 7th, the 16th. We have 5 Spanish. We have 3 Creole. We have a Portuguese, a Russian, and Vietnamese interpreter. A judge decides, I need a Creole. They go ahead and select Creole. The system goes through and it finds those that meet that criteria. So now we have 3 certified Creole interpreters. It's first going to look for an interpreter that actually sits in that judge's circuit, so there's some familiarity. If it doesn't have that, it's going to cycle through and find the interpreter that's been idle the longest. That happens to be the one sitting in the 9th Circuit, and next thing you know, the judge has an interpreter that appears in the courtroom. All transparent to the judge, and it happens literally within seconds. Obviously, the issues with this, the current fiscal environment requires court to experience 100% return on the investment within the 1st or 2nd budget cycle. I don't know that that can be done for the statewide solution. We did this, though, in the 9th. Our experience, but like I said, we don't have that scalable solution that can go out without the next investment. Government decentralization versus centralization, consumer versus provider courts, recovery model, resource sharing, outsourcing versus in-house support. I know some states use almost all contractual, some use mostly in-house. Certification, requirement versus guideline. The one thing this does is it makes it much more possible to make it a requirement, because now you can provide a certified interpreter to remote areas that could not have gotten a certified interpreter before. But with this comes that. Certification requirements, growing demand will require competitive salaries to recruit and keep good interpreters. Anyone that's interested in what we're doing, our website is available, and that's at 9thcircuit.org. We have a dedicated page of centralized remote interpreting that actually has the video you just saw, a couple more videos. And if you have very little life, the PowerPoint also is on there. And it has, we encourage site visits for anyone that wants to come out, video conferences, teleconference calls with staff. And for that, Tom.
Didn't talk for a long time so we could have some discussion, because it's such an interesting topic and hopefully important for all of you. So I'm just going to make a few more concluding comments, and then we'll go directly to your questions and comments. When Matt was talking about interpretation from anywhere, I know that that's true, because Matt and I were at a conference a few weeks ago up in Salem, Massachusetts, and he brought with him one of his interpreters, Odie, who had nothing but a laptop, and we had nothing coming into that room except an internet connection. And with about, 10 minutes, 5 minutes of setup, she did real simultaneous interpretation to the courthouse back in Orlando, right in front of our eyes. So I know from personal experience that it can happen. And just to give you an idea of how far from the art of the possible that is, how routine technically that kind of thing is now. 7 or 8 years ago, Courtroom 21 did a show trial. Now, I don't know how many of you are familiar with Courtroom 21. It's kind of a high-tech courtroom at William and Mary Law. 7 or 8 years ago, they did one of their show trials where they had each participant in the trial in a different country in the world, and did a virtual trial, a 100% virtual trial using video technology, and pulled it off. So this kind of thing is child's play compared to that. How serious it is for all of you is a business problem, though. Remember I mentioned the DOJ civil rights requirements. Some of you may know that the Department of Justice has taken those requirements very seriously, and to the point where they've gone out and audited state court systems, and in some cases actually threatened to revoke all federal funding to the court system if they didn't comply with those requirements. So these are not hypothetical business problems for the courts. They're very real and in people's faces right now. And the one other thing I wanted to mention or point out that Irvin had mentioned in passing is when he was talking about upgrading a statewide network, I know for many of you in some states it can be a problem having a good enough internet feed to your court to be able to do things like this. Of course, this becomes easier and easier as time goes on because the connections get better and the costs of doing it get lower. But I think one of the things we would tell you at the National Center is that it's going to become mandatory to have those good internet connections in a courthouse anyway for other reasons, and so it's a strategic investment and you just have to bite the bullet at some point, so whether it's for remote interpretation or e-courts in general. So having made those comments, let me throw it open for questions and comments from you all, and because this is being recorded, Irvin's going to bring the mic to you if you have a question or comment so everyone can hear. So John.
I was very interested watching Matt's video with the person for whom the interpretation being done, having those earphones over the ears. Bonnie Huff in California did some focus groups of the persons for whom the proceedings were being interpreted a couple of years ago, and came up with this really interesting finding that they wanted not simultaneous translation. They wanted what is subsequent? Consecutive. Yeah. Because they were not completely ignorant of English. They wanted the opportunity to hear the judge and then hear the interpretation. So they were listening to the judge with one ear and to the interpreters standing beside them with another ear, and really being confused by it and really wanting it to be consecutive, which of course is impossible for the courts because it elongates the hearing, it doubles the time of the hearing. This solution of putting the earphones on doesn't give them the opportunity to do their own consecutive listening with one ear and the other ear. They are limited only to the interpreter in the consecutive environment. And that may actually, what you were reporting, that the attorney said this was a better system, it may actually be a better system in that regard as well.
Thank you.
John, I'm going to let them comment. I think they will have comments, but one thing I wanted to say is we've had conversations about a national cloud capability. We've talked about needing to have 3 modes of interpretation. So one is consecutive, one is simultaneous, and one is private sidebar, because you can imagine there are reasons why you need that as well with your client. So that's where we've set the bar from a business point of view, is you have to be able to provide all 3 modes, because there are times when a court's going to want each of those modes. You heard Matt say in passing that it's most expensive and most complex to do the simultaneous, but you can certainly operate in those other modes if you need to. So go ahead, Marcus.
Yeah, no, just briefly, and John, I think your point is well taken. I would just mention that the headset I showed from Maricopa County actually had the 2 channels. Now, I'm not sure how they have that configured, how they're using that, but that idea was that you would have the live court proceedings, but then in this other ear or in the second channel would be the interpretation, but could be then simultaneous or consecutive. But I'm not sure how they're configured right now, but it at least had that capacity there.
Yeah, did you have
That's controlled by the mixture control software that you saw. They can toggle between a consecutive or simultaneous mode, so they can provide it either way. Obviously, for court proceedings, the simultaneous is much more preferred.
Just one comment on that I'd like to make. it's important on this topic, I think, that the court makes the decision on how the interpreting is delivered, not the party, for purpose of maintaining the record. So the sooner we incorporate these policies into our case management, the better it is. And so we do have to have exceptions for low-functioning individuals, deaf persons who do not sign, or illiterate individuals. But these policies should be included, and the judge should decide then what to do in certain situations.
Question. For the interpreters, what kind of qualification and licensing do you require as far as being able to really interpret for the court? Because it's almost like, which they don't really need counsel at that time, but they need to have some good knowledge of the legal system, at least for that region. What kind of certification have you put in place, or what do you recommend?
Our state courts, all of the. Do you guys want to go first?
No, you go.
We had a consortium of language access now, which is part of the National Center of State Courts, and we have a certification process that's pretty much now accepted in every state. That requires pragmatic language knowledge, interpreting skills. You have to pass a certification exam, oral certification exam. There's a background check, and there's orientation into the state court system. And we also have reciprocity among the states that varies from state to state. The benefit of a national pool of interpreters with reciprocity across the country will be that you have these basic fundamentals of requisite certification and standards that everybody will comply with. Now, the discussion may have to include certain state-specific training, so an interpreter will have access to resources, and a glossary that Florida needs. And we will have. Remember, the judge could choose which interpreter to pull into the courtroom. I hope, and I think there will be a group of interpreters that will sort of qualify for Florida or Arizona type of proceedings.
Yeah, just briefly, Arizona is not part of a national certification program. However, the testing is really very rigorous, and so in my experience, most of the interpreters would actually be degreed and would pass both written and oral test. And it's interesting too, because I guess it's not just the day-to-day interpreting, but all the legal terminology, that type of thing. So I think they're of high quality. That's a good question. And there's been some talk about, gosh, then should we be part of that national certification? But no decision on that yet.
Next question was here.
My question is the private conversation between the attorney and the client, and does the attorney have a headset and have his or her questions and answers and communication with the client confidential?
Yeah, on our website, there's another video that actually demonstrates that with the interpretations done out at the jail. It's the attorney standing next to the litigant, and yeah, it's the same situation.
What did you guys do to encourage your judges to opt to use remote interpreters versus in-person interpreters?
Yeah, I can answer that. Our chief judge is sitting there right there. You have to have very strong judicial leadership because it is a bit of a culture shift. Now, we have had historically a culture of technology in our circuit, and we were doing centralized remote interpreting as early as '97. So there was that culture, but it really takes strong judicial leadership because, Judge Perry at one point said, "You want an interpreter? This is the way you're getting it," and that kind of solved the problem. So.
Marcus.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Our experience was the same. Very strong executive sponsorship or support from the presiding judge. And then this is just a little confession. Arizona uses a lot of court commissioners. I don't know if they'd be like an associate judge or a magistrate. Well, they're appointed by the court. They don't have quite that level. And we did start in those sorts of calendars with kind of the front-end criminal cases, and I mentioned some of the lower court matters. But I think all that aside, I think the quality is just absolutely critical. So we said whenever they would come to my office, we need another $20,000 for the pilot project. And it was like, oh gosh, for that black box, you know. But we decided to really spare no expense. So it would have those tilt camera I showed you and the closed private conversations. And my sense was this is something that you just can't slop around with. So we thought even out of the box it needed to be just the very best it could be. And I felt like the team really delivered on that. I thought the vendors have delivered on that. And I think anything short of that, you would be hearing those arguments. That's why I think if you peer into the future, I think we may see more longer matters. It might not just be these short hearings. I could see a half day of motion practice, let's say in a civil case, and folks will just they'll become accustomed to that and comfortable with that. At least that's my hope.
Yeah.
One follow-up comment to that would be, in our experience with the judges, if we involve the judges in finding solutions instead of giving them something that's going to be another obstacle that the judges have to deal with, the chances of embracing these kind of solutions are going to be much higher.
Thank you. I was wondering if you could go back and address the certification issue a little bit farther. In Michigan, we've had this conversation for many, many years. We don't have a standard certification process. And one of the concerns that's been raised, in part raised by the interpreters themselves, is that if you force us to go through a certification process, our fees are going up. And they're going to go up significantly. And I'm curious if that's been the experience elsewhere or if that's bluffing on the interpreter's part. And in our situation, we don't have, most of our courts are decentralized, and many of them can't support staff interpreters. So we're contracting with the open market, and we're driven by those market forces.
Yeah, maybe I'll respond to that, Kevin. I can't remember who put that slide up, but one of the things that we're planning to do as part of this national capability is to compile at the National Center a database of all the certified interpreters in the whole country. I'm going to get kind of to where you were going, but I'm starting here. And as you can imagine, each state practically has different requirements for certification. There's not one national requirement for it. So there's been a debate at the level of the state court systems about whether they would try and achieve one certification requirement or not, before they even get to the problem you've got. And frankly, it's politically pretty hard to do that. So probably what we'll do in the initial instance is just compile the information in the database for people to see. And if they're willing to use an interpreter from another state, even though their certification requirements are different, or another jurisdiction, then they can make that choice to use it or not use it. And that principle then kind of extends beyond certification, since, as you heard, there's a limited number of languages for which there are certification tests, and there are interpreters who are good who don't take those tests, and many languages where you get what you get, regardless of where they came from and what they know. And so the database will hopefully have that kind of information as well, so you can make your own business decisions about what you're willing to accept and not accept in your particular situation. If you want to really drill down on that, we have sitting in the room right over here. Why don't you stand up for a minute, Tina? Tina Vagenis heads the interpreter unit at the National Center who do the testing. So she's would be happy to answer those kinds of more detailed questions after the session about where they're at on trying to get that done. But we do envision having in the database interpreters who are not certified, because when certification is not possible or not available, but you still need an interpreter, it's still better to have someone who's qualified in some way rather than Sam down the street who works at the gas station.
Just for a practical purpose, before we went to remote interpreting, we had a very difficult time. We require certification, but we had a very difficult time retaining staff interpreters. In fact, most of our contractual interpreters used to be Ninth Circuit interpreters. The state of Florida has done a better job at adjusting some of the salaries for certified interpreters, but by going to remote, our demand for contractual has gone down so much, we do not have any problem holding on to interpreters now. We have a much more stable workforce of certified interpreters.
Interesting.
Are there implications for remote interpreting for limited English proficient individuals that need access to the courts for non-hearing related issues like employment opportunities or
questions directed to the AOC or become a certified process server or things like that?
I didn't hear the question. I'm sorry. Oh.
You know, those are interesting. We kind of brainstormed some of those ideas in Arizona, but we have not provided any of those kinds of services to date. So, but you raise a good point. I mean, once we have this kind of infrastructure, that's why I kind of mentioned the counter clerks and other areas like that, where anything that would help with access, I think we should be considering that, and especially as these costs would drop for some of the mobile devices. It's a great idea.
Tina, you can, if they pass the mic to you, maybe you can confirm or deny this, but I thought the Civil Rights Division had tried to push the courts into some requirements that went beyond formal hearings in the courtroom, providing interpreters in other contexts as well. But, Irvin, can you give her the mic?
So DOJ did try to push that certain other proceedings are included, but it's still not clear certain if some things outside of the courtroom are included. So we're a little careful about kind of the direction that we give. But again, I'm happy to talk to anybody offline kind of about the nuances.
I'd like to comment. In Kentucky, we resolved that actually we have a Supreme Court rule. Essentially, every court function that belongs to the Court of Justice, we provide interpreting services for. Sometimes remotely, especially for the deaf and hard of hearing, that includes emergency hearing, EPOs, DVOs, and those sort of things, or telephonic interpreting. So whoever flips the bill, if it's a prosecutor or a defense attorney whose responsibility is to provide service, then we don't do it. But if it belongs to the Court of Justice, we decided to provide language access.
Do either of you tape what the interpreter says to the individual, or what the individual responds back to the interpreter? And if not, would you recommend that that be done or not?
We can, but we don't. It's just the stuff that goes over the PA is recorded, but the private conversation is not recorded.
And that would be the same for Arizona. It's an interesting question. I really hadn't thought about it, but that would be something to consider.
I actually have two questions. The first is, I'm familiar with the training with the consortium. Remote interpreting also includes another skill level of using that equipment. Do you require training of your interpreters on how to use that system? And my second question is on the technology and how you're able to allow the interpreters in through your network systems. I'm from Minnesota. We have to provide bridge secured systems. It sounds like you're not using those types of securities, and how do you get around those?
The first question on training, we found it's actually exceptionally easy to use. So when our we have one station set up for contract interpreters, so it's really more of an orientation than training, and within 5 minutes they're pretty good on the system. As far as security, our courtrooms are set up. We can set them both ways. One to auto answer, or that the courtroom actually has to answer for them. So you can set it up either way. On our remote sites, we set up for auto answer, because right now the judges want the court interpreter to initiate the call, so it has to be on auto answer. But in most cases, once you go pooled, that call is going to come from the courtroom. So the auto answer is on the other end. So the security is more on their end than ours, because we're calling out. Yeah. And what do you mean by phone lines? On phone lines right now, we're just using the network.
Secure network.
Secure network, yeah. But they're using the video and audio of the network, but they're calling in. Our interpreter is actually placing from outside. The only people that are coming in from the outside now are our own interpreters. Right now, we have used remote interpreters with a telephone interface where there's no video. So from their cell phone, it's using our initial installation. But if we have an interpreter appearing from California, they'll use their cell phone and they'll call, and they're just using an analog telephone line, and that's as secure as any. Just for the audio, correct. They could do it by video if they had Jabber video and we put it on auto answer. Yes, they could get in.
I was going to mention, I think the staff training was remarkable, and again, that human factor. There was one maybe a little bit younger of the interpreters who seemed to be very open, worked with us on this and just became pretty excited about this, kind of another one of those sponsors, if you will. And so I think that sort of spread through the office. Where I don't see as much of that would be, you have these kind of superstar interpreters that would do more of the capital cases and whatnot, and I think they are in very high demand for the in-courtroom proceedings. And so I don't even know that they've been trained to use it, but my sense is they're generally always going to be in the courtrooms. But I think at least half the office of those maybe 30 staff interpreters they had sort of an orientation. I think Matt's right, kind of a quick learning curve on that.
Yeah, it's interesting that you should ask both those questions, because for the national project, you can imagine how big those concerns are. If you're trying to provide real-time interpreters nationally, to maybe the court hasn't ever done that with the vendor before. Training and security are the two big issues, and we've given a lot of thought to that in the national project. It didn't come out quite as clear in Matt's presentation this time because he compressed it so much, but it was interesting to me that as Matt tried to scale up from one court to several courts to a region to counties to state, one of the things that you saw happening, partly just because the technology gets better, is it got simpler and it got more foolproof, if there's ever such a thing as technology being foolproof. And it also got cheaper. And so one of the advantages as we've thought that through is it becomes easier to do without it having glitches, and it becomes less training becomes required. On the security side, we weren't going to get into the geeky part of this too much, but it's almost a given that you're going to have to use something called a virtual private network to do this. And what that would require on the local level for the court with their protected network is they'd have to open a gateway for that VPN to come in. But that's, if they know to do that, that's a trivial exercise. I can't hear it.
Can you do that through the cloud?
Yes. Yeah. Any other questions or comments? I think we wore you out. Thanks for your attention. Yeah.
Thank you.